So if I ever start feeling like I'm not giving enough time to my own creativity, I have to reassess the balance of what I'm doing. And then if I find that I'm in a season that's really heavy on client work, I have to remember that that's part of what gives me the freedom to do the creative work.
Welcome to the Creative Chats podcast with Mike Brennan. Welcome to another episode of Creative Chats. It's the podcast for artist makers and content creators where we talk about creativity, the creative process, and story. I'm your host, Mike Brennan. I'd love to invite you to stop by dailycreativehabit.com. I have created all sorts of resources for you because I truly believe that when you create, we all win. So I want to see as many of you stepping into your creativity fully, closing the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And I want to help you do that. So I've created resources like the Daily Creative Habit Journal. I've written a book, Make Fun a Habit. I have all sorts of free resources like this podcast and a Facebook group called Daily Creative Habit. Also, the paid membership for Daily Creative Habit, where we get together with like-minded creators, all pushing in the same direction, encouraging each other, and saying we're going to show up every single day to create something to get our work out there into the world. So if you would like to be a part of any of those things, again, stop by dailycreativehabit.com or simply visit my website, which is mikebrennan.me. Hey, for this episode, I get to sit down with a friend of mine, Haley Walden. And Haley has been a friend of mine probably for a few years. We are in a mastermind together. And we were also at the Thing event most recently that took place in Nashville, Tennessee. And Haley is a great creative person, a writer, a creative thinker. She is someone who I think is a great example of someone who has embraced the more commercial side, if you will, in doing some client work and brand voicing. And then also has embraced her personal passion projects of writing novels and fantasy. And she talks about balancing the two and kind of moving in and out of both of those things, listening to yourself in the journey and being sure that you're showing up the right ways for yourself and also for client work. And so I'm sure that if you find yourself in the balance in between those two things, this episode is really going to speak to you. So without further ado, here is my creative chat with Haley Walden. Well, Haley, welcome to the Creative Chats podcast, my friend.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I love that we're able to have this conversation today. And for those who are listening to the podcast right now, Haley and I are in a mastermind together, and we frequent the Thing conference and event. And so we have history. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation to probe a little bit deeper, honestly, because even sometimes on those calls, you know, we're talking about top level stuff and in the moment stuff, but we don't necessarily get to some of the more like origin story stuff. And so I'm excited to talk to you about that today.
Yeah, me too. Let's do it.
So for people, when you're at a party or someplace and people are like, hey, who are you? What do you do? Like, what's your little elevator pitch of a line that's like basically encapsulates what you do for work and, you know?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Generally, I start with I'm a writer, and then I split that and say I'm a marketing copywriter, and also I'm a fantasy fiction author.
Yeah.
So that's the simplest way to describe it.
Right. And then people get curious and they ask questions about that. Ooh, fantasy writer. Like, what does that look like? Right.
Yeah, exactly. I want to know, like, are your books in the bookstores, and where can I find them, and what are they about? And on marketing copywriting, I found pretty quickly in my career that people, they associate the word copywriting with copyright, like intellectual property rights. And so then there's always a little education on, no, like if you've ever, heard a commercial or looked at a website and read the words on the website, that's what I do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, because it's like comes from the same source in terms of like writing, right? That's the modality here. But how you apply that, it's a variety of contexts. And I love that you're able to move in and out of those spaces, because so many times people are just like the one thing, they write for this context and they can't do it for something else. And so for you being, we were even talking before we started rolling here, just being kind of the multi-creative, that person that you are, and again, I've talked about this on the show as well. Being able to move in and out of those things, sometimes it's challenging, but it's also an asset because it gives you more to give to people and more ways to serve, right? Do you find it like a struggle, or is it usually something that you're like, it depends on whatever project is before me and I could just move in and out of things?
It usually depends. And so I've always kind of fought this internal battle with like, should I niche or just keep doing what I do? Because in terms of, the kind of copywriting work that I do, I'm a generalist. I can pick up just about any kind of project. There are certain kinds, of course, that are more exciting to me than others, but my specialty is in brand voicing. So that's normally, if a client wants me to be able to really pick up their brand voice and run with it, they know that they can send me any kind of assignment, whether it's, a video script or website copy, blog post, any of those things. And I can pick up that voice and run with that. So, yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the conventional advice, which works for a lot of people, and I'm not discounting it at all, is the fact that, you need to choose your specialty and choose your niche and kind of stay within that. And I think that works really well for people who are okay with having a more predictable rhythm. I thrive in a little bit of unpredictability as far as challenge is concerned, as far as rolling into different kinds of projects. I start to really get bogged down if things are too repetitive. And I love it when I get something creative thrown at me in the mix. I've been slowly moving my copywriting business into more of the creatively driven work, more one-on-one work, as far as, coaching and consulting around brand voice and content development, so that I'm helping other people, pull their ideas to the surface and kind of get that genius and that magic for them. And so for me, where the niche has tended to fall has more to do with the kind of person that I'm working with than the kind of work. And that even, it doesn't mean, oh, they all work in this one industry, or, they all have this kind of personality. It's more along the lines of like highly driven people who know that they have something profound to say, but they need a thought partner to help them pull that out. And so it's either that side of the coin or other leaders who are also multidisciplinary, highly creative, versatile, and they recognize that that's okay, that I am too, because they know that they can utilize the work that I do in multiple areas.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you brought up the brand voice part, because, I'm on the other part of that, the visual side, right? And so I don't do anything necessarily with any of the language and copywriting stuff. But I'm curious, when you go to basically you're trying to meet with a client and understand their voice, understand probably their personality, the context of things, right? Is there a certain process that you go through? Because in order to write like somebody else, right? Like you really have to understand what they're trying to accomplish, their personality, like those different aspects. How do you actually go about doing that?
Yeah, the MO for, I guess, when did I start this? 2015. So the past 9 or so years, the way that I've always done things has kind of been get the brain dump from the client. And so it was more brain dumpy and disorganized for a long time. And I've been moving out of that and starting to build a framework around how I do that, just to help me start to contextualize the different parts of the process, and then to help other people start to do it for themselves. And so how that usually looks is there's a process of getting, a big information download from the client. And that could look like, maybe they've already got talks that are recorded or content that they've written before, books, things like that. They can send me those things, and then I can have a few conversations with them and get a pretty good feel for how it sounds and looks and feels to hear from them, in both, recorded audio and written communication, which is really important. And I'll come back to the auditory piece in just a moment. But that goes into sort of an integration process for me. So after I talk with them, I usually have to let it simmer for just a little bit. And it's taken me several years just learning how to do this and figuring out how I work best to realize that it actually helps me to absorb that more if I take a step back and like let it sink in. So I call that integrating. It could also be considered a learning curve, I guess, but I like the idea of more of an integration, because in a way, when you are writing for someone, especially when it comes to like ghostwriting, which is something that I incorporate into the work that I do, it's almost like I'm having to become that person. So I look at it like acting. And so that's part of the auditory piece. The listening translates to mimicry, because when I'm writing for somebody, I hear what they're saying in my head, and then that comes out on the page. And that's my internal processing for actually capturing the voice. It's the listen, absorb. And then there's a ghostwriter, her name is Salwa Emerson. She described it as method writing, kind of like method acting. Mm-hmm. And I love that phrase. So I'm going to start using it. We were having a conversation on LinkedIn about that. But it takes a significant amount of energy to do. So it's been interesting to navigate and to learn how to balance that with, the other work that I do, and to figure out the time frames and everything for how the process plays out. But it's a pretty intuitive process. So it's been difficult for me to distill it down and say, okay, this is like exactly how it works. But it's always some semblance of, there's a big information download. There's a process of, processing it, and then learning how to start emulating that and kind of become that person on the page. Very much like getting into character and really having to start thinking about, okay, if I was X client, how would they say this? And then I start thinking through like what it would sound like in my head if they said, these words on the page, or vice versa. Maybe the words flow through me and then onto the page, and I can hear them in the process. So what's so interesting is, a lot of senior level copywriters who want to scale their businesses go on to teach other writers how to do what they do. And I've always felt stumped and gone, I don't know if I can teach that. Right. So I developed a process that I'm still refining for helping other people DIY their own brand voice. And I started thinking about, well, what things do I think about when I create like a guide for somebody? What steps do I go through to start describing what their brand voice sounds like, to help them really get their head around how they need to come across? And what I ended up coming up with was this interesting, almost like Jungian based brand voice, like your higher self voice and then your shadow. And the reason that I started to approach it that way was, it's important for us to know what our voice is, but we also need to know what it's not, so that we don't stray into that territory when we're communicating with every touch point of our brand. So whether that's clients, customers, social media, all these things, it's not just about, how you sound or how your people feel when they walk away, but it's also being cognizant of not falling into a territory that you don't want to be in. So when I started I've got this DIY workbook, and we can put the link to it in the notes if anybody wants to take a look. But it takes you through the process of creating, like, what is the highest self version of your brand voice? And so that's how you're best presented to your audience. And that's where you want to land in all your communications. But then as I was building this workbook, I got the idea of, well, what would it look like if we talked about the brand shadow? And it's, of course, in Carl Jung, Jungian psychology, the shadow is, the hidden parts of yourself that you either, don't want to be perceived, or the things you don't want to be. And a lot of times you've got the potential to be those things, or they're right under the surface. So we all have to recognize that we see brands faceplant all the time. We see personal and corporate brands acting out of character or doing and posting things that maybe we didn't expect, and they leave a bad taste in our mouth. And that's like the expression of that shadow. And so I built a couple of little exercises to help people really get clear on how they don't want to come across in their brand language, so that it can help them stay aware and avoid that as much as possible, and then get back on track if they find themselves acting out of character. And so that's been an interesting process. And I'm going to start applying that shadow side more with clients too, because that's a pretty new development for me. I've always talked a little bit, like if I build a brand voice guide, I say, this is what it is, this is what it isn't, but it hasn't ever been super in depth. So that's been fun to explore. But yeah.
I'm curious, like, how did you land on this being something that you really leaned heavily into? Like, was this something that you felt like you had to experience yourself and then understand it and then go, okay, now I can offer this actually as a service for other people? And what is it about the brand voice that's so attractive to you in terms of offering this as opposed to something else?
I think, I'll go backward to go forward. I've always been a storyteller, and I've been a writer. I mean, really since I was in elementary school, and I've always been pretty good at most things that I pick up in terms of the types of writing. And so pretty broad range of experience. And I stumbled into marketing with no experience in marketing in 2015. And I got a job with a book marketing firm. And they hired me as a VA because, even though I had a degree in writing, I had no marketing experience. So I had no confidence whatsoever that I could work as a marketer. So they put me in as a VA, and I'm like managing my boss's calendar and, all these communications with clients. And we were a pretty small team. So they knew that I had a writing degree, and they put me on a ghostwriting project for one of our clients. They're New York Times bestselling author, needed help with their blog. And they threw a couple of posts at me, and they said, why don't you take a crack at this? And I was able to pick up and ghostwrite for them pretty seamlessly, pretty quickly. And I just kind of got fascinated with that process. And it just sort of happened organically. And I found that along the way, whenever I picked up clients, that I had people coming to me specifically for either ghostwriting or some level of brand voice work. And that was consistently what I was getting recommended for. And so to my mind, lots and lots of writers can write excellent copy. And most of us have to have some handle on the ability to get into the brand voice, or else we wouldn't be able to keep clients. But for me, there's just that fascination of that method writing process and the ability to kind of play that character. And so for me, it's just something that has resonated and that I enjoy doing. And it's something that people consistently remember me for and recommend me for.
Yeah. I love, just going back to the method acting thing. I love how you put in those terms, because it makes so much sense that that's how you would approach it, right? In thinking about, okay, here's the person, here's how they speak, here's the words they use, and so forth. And then kind of becoming that character, as opposed to just more of a, I guess, a logical linear approach that would probably be a little more stale. I could see how that'd be attractive to you. Just curious too, so you have this side of things, right? And then we touched briefly on, you doing your fantasy novels, which we can talk about in a minute. But I'm curious about if you felt ever where you were standing in the gap of going, the tension between doing the fantasy novel stuff, which I'm sure is more of like your personal expression and passion stuff, and then also doing the brand voice stuff, which, you know, obviously you're passionate about as well, but that's more client based and serving somebody else with your skill set, right? I think a lot of times when creative people take their creativity and they're using it in service for other people and they don't have some kind of outlet that is more their own, something goes sideways and they're like, this is not, I don't feel fulfilled in the work, you know, something's not happening. I don't have a place for my own stuff to come through. Did you ever have that tension, or was there just a natural progression for you to be like, no, I'm doing these things, you know, and they're complementary?
Yeah, there has been tension at different points. And I always find that I have to course correct that, because if I'm too immersed in client work and I'm not giving time to my own creative outlet, I do get kind of resentful. And that doesn't work for me, because at this point, you know, my copywriting is really what pays the bills. So I have to make sure that I'm leaning into that enough and with gratitude so that I can support my family and then also support my ability to keep publishing. So I don't see, and you know, who knows, but I don't see any point when I wouldn't want to do both, just because I love the idea of having the diversified income streams, multiple ways of supporting myself. You know, I don't know. The best way to describe it is like a safety net. I would, even though a lot of people kind of turn their nose up at that phrasing, and I feel a little hesitant to use it, I do like to have lots of options. And so for me, the options equal more freedom. So if I ever start feeling like I'm not giving enough time to my own creativity, I have to reassess the balance of what I'm doing. And then if I find that I'm in a season that's really heavy on client work, I have to remember that that's part of what gives me the freedom to do the creative work, because I'm still a baby author. I've got 4 books out, but I have taken a pretty slow approach to marketing those, and actually been published for 4 years, but only just got in print this year because I've been taking slow, methodical baby steps toward building that. I know that my books are evergreen. So even if things don't, you know, blow up and pick up snowball speed immediately, I can continually work on those and work on how to get them in front of the right readers, not rush anything, and not, you know, especially with the kind of writing that I do, and any author will tell you that you don't want to hit the wrong audience. So I've been pretty careful about how I market, who I put the books in front of, and that kind of thing, just to make sure that I'm serving the right readers. But yeah, there've been different points where I'll either feel like things are imbalanced, or I'm spending a little more time on my fiction, and then maybe the client work gets a little bit difficult, and vice versa. You know, maybe I'm too immersed in client work and not putting enough time into the creative outlet. So it's really I mean, I don't really believe that actual balance is a real thing for me. It could be for some people, but I don't want to create a dogmatic idea around it. I just see it as keeping different plates spinning, I guess, so that there's not necessarily like, oh, well, we have an equal amount of time for this and an equal amount of time for this. And, you know, because when I think about balance, I think about it a little too literally. So yeah. I use the word, but it's like Inigo Montoya says, I don't think that word means what you think it means.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and really all these things are like living, breathing organisms, right? Like, it's not like you just set something and forget it. Because let's be honest, you grow as a person, right? You evolve, your interests and your abilities and your capacities change. And then also sometimes the market changes, right? Well, I mean, we've both seen that, where all of a sudden one thing that used to be the bulk of what we're doing is changed because of something, right? I mean, AI has disrupted a lot of things, right? And so there's a lot of people in that camp. But I think having those multiple pursuits and those things where you're just seeing, what does this season bring? what's right for me in this next season. I think, right? At least that's the way I've always approached it, and said, let me lean into those things. Let me lean into those opportunities, do the best that I can with those, and then continue to assess as you go, because you may find certain opportunities come up and maybe it's right and maybe it's not, maybe it's the wrong time for something. And so that's all part of this, just environment that we set up for ourselves as multiple creative, people, to navigate that and make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, making sure we make time for that. Like you said, that kind of, it doesn't get out of whack where we're doing too much client stuff or not enough, and figuring that out. The only way you do that is by actually showing up, doing the work, and then continually assessing, right? I mean, would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I have to assess my attitude a lot, because I've been in a season of long hours, incredibly busy. There's phases to the pieces of creativity too, depending on what you do. In my case, as an author, it takes time to write the books. It takes time to market. It took a lot of time to put the books into print. And so I had to step back and assess at the beginning of this year. All right, now I can go ahead and write my next book, or I need to get these books into print so that they have another format that they're going out in. That's another income stream, right? So I took a very quiet 6-month hiatus from actively writing to focus on making sure that the books were clean and formatted, and they had been in ebook format for a long time. So you can update that if you find mistakes or whatever. And I definitely wanted to go back through my early books and proofread those again before I put them in print, because I didn't want to be in a tailspin about that later. So I took 6 months, and I'd slowly worked through the first 3 books in my series, and got 4 total into print before I started writing again. And that was frustrating in a way, because I'm impatient and I want my story to flow, but at the same time, okay, like I can't keep neglecting this part of it. So we're going to work on that, and then we're going to come back. And so all that time, I'm writing in my head and coming up with ideas and everything, so that when I finally started sitting back down with the drafting over the past month, it's flowing out really well. But it's this, when you're having to juggle, right? Because if all I did was write, I could just flow that process and things would happen faster. Well, I say all I could do is write. That is all I do. But if all I could do is my fiction, but because I have the client work, I have to, keep that part in motion as well. And so sometimes for me, that means setting down part of the fiction process in order to focus on something like marketing or a launch or something like that, while I continue to keep my clients happy too. So it's, I have to go back to the idea of gratitude, because if you're a multi-potential freelancer or business owner, or however you want to position yourself, you're going to have to continually reassess. I have to reassess my business at least every 6 months. Sometimes it's more often than that, but sometimes it means that you have to just remind yourself that you're grateful, because you might get frustrated with, like, this creative personal work over here is not progressing the way I want it to, or at the pace I want it to. But would I be able to pursue that at this point in my life with the circumstances as they are right now, without the client work? Right. So for me, it's anytime I start to get frustrated or resentful that, oh, well, my books don't earn as much as I want them to yet, then I have to kind of slow myself down and go, I'm really grateful for the fact that I have solid client relationships and a pretty healthy inflow of new work in this season after a long season of uncertainty. And it really comes back down to gratitude and trying to balance your own expectations from one day to the next. And just, I know the way that I am, I tend to think that I should get a certain amount of stuff done, or it should look a certain way. So I have to just make sure that, like, even if I can't write like a 1,500 word chapter in one day, maybe I sit down and look at the document, write 2 or 3 paragraphs. That's what I did yesterday. A few days before that, I wrote a whole chapter. But all I could do last night was fix a little section of dialogue that was stumping me and then go to bed. So, but that was okay because I did something with it.
Yeah. And it's progress over perfection, right? I mean, and not every day, it's not going to look different. I mean, it's not going to look the same every day. It's going to look different depending upon your capacity, depending upon a lot of things that are happening. And I think as long as you're showing up and doing the work in whatever way that you can in that day, that's success, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about so the content, right? We've talked about your books and your 4 books, but for people who are wondering, they're like, okay, tell me, what are they about? Like, what is this, what are the stories? Tell us a little bit about the context of the stories and why you went into that as your venue.
Yeah. So, I've always been obsessed with fantasy stories and, going back, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Disney, Star Wars, all the things. And so Chronicles of Narnia. And I went through a long season in my 20s, out of college, where I wasn't writing fiction. I went through a period of not reading fiction. And I had a friend in around 2016 who introduced me to indie fiction novels. I had never really read anything published by an indie author. And they were fantasy, kind of like a romantic fantasy. It was epic with romance subplots. And it was really fascinating to me because the world sucked me in. And I was thinking, I think I could write something like this. And I hadn't touched, fiction writing in a long time before that. And previously I had written long form stuff that I never tried to publish, poetry, songs, short stories, things like that. And anything novel length that I had done was fan fiction in high school. So I was reading these books and I'm kind of thinking to myself, I think I could do this, and kind of picking up on the elements of the story that I was really fascinated by. So I got fascinated with romantic fantasy and decided that I want to try my hand at writing a story like that. And I had no idea where to start, but I had this idea that was kind of poking at the back of my mind about revisionist history and conspiracy theories. And the book has some elements of the idea of histories written by the victors. The early seeds for it, which are not even present in the book anymore, came from an extended family rift that happened in my family over a conspiracy theory that our family historian found. And I won't go into details about what that was, but there was a lot of tension over it. And this family historian was somebody who was hand selected by his grandmother. And this plays into how I got the inspiration for my books. And this was a branch of my family that is from, I think originally they traced their lineage back to Scotland and Scottish clans. And so this was my great uncle, who was the historian. His grandmother named him the next family historian after her, and they called it the witness tree of the family. So it's based on the idea that a tree that's been standing over 100 years has borne witness to all sorts of things. They talk about Civil War battlefields having witness trees that still stand from when that battle happened. And so great uncle Robert was the witness tree. And there was this tradition back then on that side of the family where the grandmother kind of took him under her wing and taught him all the stories of our family. And she passed down heirlooms to him. And then when he became an adult, he ended up growing up and becoming a researcher, which is how he uncovered some controversial information that that created some tension. And so I started thinking about that, and I thought, what would that look like in a fantasy setting? And so the main character of my story is a historian who was chosen by her grandmother to inherit the magical memories of her world. But the clash for her is that she's very indoctrinated in the revisionist histories and what the victors wrote, and to the point that she works for the king and is completely immersed in that. And so the whole idea behind the story is, what would it be like for a completely indoctrinated historian to inherit memory magic that contradicts everything? And so that was the seed and where it started. And I thought it was going to be one book, and now it's 4, and we're not done. So it's very it's an epic fantasy with what they call a soft magic system. So there's elements of the system that aren't always fully explained. There's some magic systems in fantasy we consider a hard magic system. A writer like Brandon Sanderson is a great example of that, where every element is explained in almost a mathematical sense. But we have a softer system. We have a close focus on characters and character relationships, lots of political intrigue, lots of magic, snarky characters who are imperfect, but they're a lot of fun and you can't help but root for them. So I've been told that tonally it feels a little bit like Game of Thrones light, but I've never watched or read Game of Thrones. So it's definitely not as brutal, but it's I could see, there's a lot of that intrigue and maneuvering, and being a history geek myself, I was inspired by, histories of the Tudor era in England and all the different, nobles who maneuvered to try to get power, and the stories of Imperial Russia. And like, I'm a sucker for the movie Anastasia. That sent me down a Russian Revolution rabbit hole when I was like 13. So all of these like different things that I've studied kind of gelled into this sprawling story that I'm trying to wrangle with all these characters who do exactly what they want.
Yeah. I love that you took the stuff that you knew, right? The stuff that was influencing you, and you've kind of channeled it into this. And I guess, that's what people say, right? They say you write what you know, right? And in this exploration of things and creating these worlds and these characters and things, I mean, you have the ability to probe and ask questions and go further into research and really follow your curiosity, right? It's something I talk about a lot. What else are you curious about that you would love to bring into your work, whether it's on the client side or more of your novel side?
On my novel side, I'm always trying to do a better job of creating really complex characters. And I think probably that's the reason for the soft magic system, because I'd so much rather focus on the character interactions and really, getting those right and resonant for the reader. So any kind of continued development as far as that goes, learning more about complex character arcs and character-driven storylines is probably where I'm going to land on the fiction side. On the copywriting side, I've been moving into more creative work in that world, starting to move into more themed entertainment. I've worked with a company for a long time that focuses on themed entertainment, but my focus with them has been more in marketing, and I'm starting to move into more of the actual entertainment-based projects with that. And I'm finding myself really fascinated by that process. I'm learning as I go. I'm still pretty new at it, but I can see myself moving toward more of that creative work on the client side that keeps me on my toes, while continuing to grow this, one-to-one work in brand voicing and content development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you find that when you're doing work in one category, it influences the other at all? Or like, is there any piece of it that you can take away from it?
Occasionally it just depends on what it is. But I feel more like I'm sort of drawing from like an inner well of all the things that I've learned. And it's hard to like compartmentalize that too much.
Mm-hmm.
Like the really boring answer is that SEO keywords can be pulled out. That knowledge can be pulled out and applied to almost anything. I don't know why that popped in my head, but I was like, well, we'll just say it because it's weird, whatever.
I love that. And that's also one of the things you talk about is embracing your weird, right? And the sense of not just, being weird for weird's sake, but really because it's the things that make us that maybe somebody thinks is weird or maybe we think is weird. But really, at the end of the day, it's just it's kind of like an ingredient inside of us, right? How do you talk about that and encourage people to embrace their weird?
Yeah, that's something that I really just started exploring. And, we were both at the thing in Nashville this summer, and I gave my first talk, and it was about being weird and using, whatever you think is weird about you, because it doesn't matter really like what the outside world says. It's so subjective, what one person thinks is weird about them, somebody else isn't going to think twice about that. And so it really has a whole lot to do with self-perception. And so I talk a lot about, letting your weird kind of be part of why you do what you do. A lot of us who are in business for ourselves, we're doing it because there's some, we've got some drive within us that would be considered weird by the status quo. We're not doing the typical path. And that looks different for everybody. And as to why you do that, for me, the reason I started working for myself was because I had two little kids who had health issues, and I could not hold up to a 9-to-5 job outside the home. And so my weird during that season was the schedule that I needed to be on and where I needed to be. And then that kind of turned into this sort of drive to want to build something of my own. And, it can look different for everybody. These days, my weird has looked a little more like overcoming some chronic health issues that have meant that I needed to retool my business a little bit and figure out, okay, well, if my energy is going to be finite certain times of the day, if I'm not going to be able to push the way I used to, then what does that need to look like, and what do I need to focus on, and what kinds of work are going to help me sustain my energy instead of draining it, right? So it's just different for everybody, but I love the idea of embracing it and being okay with it, even if you feel uncomfortable with that. So, because weird can look like your interests, it can look like the way you communicate, it can look like the way you work, lots of different things. And so it's really just about kind of sitting with yourself and trying to make peace with the fact that, yeah, like this thing about me either looks or feels different, and it can feel different to you, or it can feel different to other people outside you. And we all have the opportunity to sit down and go, I think I'm okay with that. And how can I make that work for me instead of fighting it, Mm-hmm. And one of the like personal journeys that I've been on for the past several years is I was told by a mentor, and I had no idea, but a very insightful, discerning mentor several years ago, who said, you and I are a lot alike. We had sat down and hashed out a lot of our, we had twin personality assessments in all these different areas, but we show up in the world very differently. And she said, you fight against your natural wiring harder than anybody I've ever met. And I'm like, what? And I've been on this journey of figuring out, okay, so like, how am I fighting against myself? Because I'm not even fully aware of this. And so it's probably been, 6-7 years of me really getting into a better relationship with myself and realizing the areas that okay, well, this is part of my weird and I need to be okay with it. And it's okay that maybe this is how I need to approach the way I work, or, maybe this is how I relate to people, or, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's kind of a complex topic. It's more complex than straightforward. And I'm still working on ways to simplify how I talk about it. But I've just spent a lot of time thinking about that. And my stream of consciousness is probably one of my traits that I consider weird. Anybody who spent any time with me for very long, like the way that I bounce from one topic to another is something that, I've learned not to worry too much if somebody thinks it's strange, because I'm like, well, you know what? I amuse myself.
Yeah. Well, and on the other side of that, I think when people attach too much of feeling like, okay, this is weird, I'm weird in this area, mm-hmm. Shame can show up in a big way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that really makes somebody shut down and hide and not fully embrace themselves. And then that affects the work that they do as well, and how they see things and how they show up in the world. And so there's so much kind of attached to that. Like you said, it's a complex issue and a complex conversation. But I'm glad at least we were able to touch on it a little bit to maybe make somebody think about that in terms of weirdness and authenticity and shame, and in maybe ways that they hadn't before. Because it's just been kind of low grade, below the surface, and kind of like, I just doing my thing, and this is kind of there, and every once in a while it'll pop up and be an issue, but for the most part I can kind of navigate around it. I think diving into that deep pool is very, very worth it. And the things I've heard you share about it even as well has been really helpful.
I appreciate that. And yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The shame piece is what really the core of what I was struggling with. And it was learning how to, recognize when this is getting activated, and then try to start healing the things that were activating that. And, being able to recognize, when am I going into shame, and when am I hiding, and what can I do to stop this loop? Right.
Yeah.
And that all of that involves embracing the things that I think make me weird, or just learning to be okay with the fact that other people might think that in a derogatory way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Haley, I'm glad that you have been on this journey and processing these things and sharing them with us. And even going back to the brand, voice, you mentioned earlier, I want to make sure that as we're kind of closing things out, it's top of mind for people to be sure to go and take advantage of this resource that you've provided. So where can people find that? It's on your website, correct?
Yeah, my website is HaleyWalden.com, and it's just right at the bottom of the homepage. There's a link to grab a copy of a DIY brand voice workbook, and that's the workbook that takes you through the higher self of your brand voice and the brand shadow, and helps you start to get clear on what your voice is and how you can apply that to show up in the world.
Awesome. Love it. Love it. And so, yes, we will put that in the show notes, and I highly encourage people to go to check that out and embrace the authenticity and lean into the brand voice, and show up in this world as we really need to show up, and not to hide, not to be filled with that shame, but really to show up in confidence and with saying, this is who I am and this is what I have to offer, and helping and loving the people around us. So thank you so much for this time today. I always love spending time with you, and it's great to spend some one-on-one time with you like this, of course, with the listeners here as well. But again, thank you, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll chat again.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe, leave a rating and a review. It really helps this podcast be seen and heard by others.